MS-DOS era is certainly an interesting time of experiments. Some of them, like Doom, would go on to build a long-lasting legacy, but others, like Hocus Pocus, have been mostly lost to the passage of time. One such sadly most forgotten game is Raptor Call of the Shadows. Well, it got a port on iOS in 2010 and hasn't been given too much attention since then. So in the hopes of getting a little more focus on such a charming game, here's my review. As you can probably see with your own eyes, unless you've just got this video playing in the background, Raptor Call of the Shadows is a top-down scrolling shooter. It has a high score system, but it's not just a number for bragging rights. Between missions, you can visit a shop to get everything you need to get started. In the shop, you can buy health in bursts of 25 up to 100 units maximum. You can also buy additional 100 unit shields up to 7, but they're much more expensive, and I'd really only get those on tougher levels. You can also find health in 25 units within the levels, and they can replenish partially damaged shields, but it's greatly diminished compared to your base health. Naturally, once an extra shield is depleted, it's gone for good. You need to be careful not to let your health dip too low, because if you get into critical with a siren, any additional hits actually randomly take away your weapons. Yep, this game doesn't operate on critical existence failure. You can actually lose your stuff if you're at the brink. Other categories of equipment include a boss radar that I always buy ASAP to see their health bar, as well as various kinds of weapons. You start with a machine gun that stacks with the other weapons, and you can get 2 others that also stack with every weapon. The stackers are plasma cannon and micro missile. Obviously both are worth having ASAP to raise your overall destructive power by just a bit. Everything else you switch between. You've got ground-based weapons, aerial-based weapons, and a couple that track targets. Like health, you can find weapons between levels, and there's actually a trick to getting as much cash as you want if there's a high-level weapon near the beginning of a level. Bailing out doesn't replenish your health and actually costs any money you gain, so it sounds like a bad idea, but you keep any equipment you find. Thus, you can sell a weapon you find and get some money out of it. Here's a hot tip. Bravo Sector 6 stage has dummy missiles near the start that are worth quite a bit, making it well worth your efforts. The minigun is an interesting weapon. It works like your base machine gun, but stacks on and tracks the nearest target. It even has limited ground tracking with ground targets that attack like trucks and tanks, as well as supply depots. You can also get a tracking laser turret weapon that's more instant, but it lacks the ground targeting, so you're more vulnerable to things that attack you from below. In that sense, it's a balancing act with many of the weapons. The penultimate weapons, though, are the 2 laser weapons. Naturally, they're also the most expensive. The Death Ray is the single laser variant, still quite devastating in its own right and cutting through just about everything. It's straightforward, so you're taking more of a risk than with tracker weapons, but it compensates with stopping power. The Twin Laser, as you would guess, doubles it up, inflicting true damage, and everything short of bosses is obliterated almost immediately. You also have an ultimate clear everything away nuclear option, aka a Mega Bomb. They come in a limited quantity, of course, and tougher enemies might not be destroyed in one hit, especially obviously bosses. Still, it's really easy to have if you're just being pounded on by everything on screen, or if certain enemies' laid bombs are about to get you, since it also destroys projectiles. Of course, it needs a bit of time to hit the ground. You can buy up to 5 of them and they aren't that expensive, so feel free to load up on them. You never know when you might want to pop one down. Every stage has a boss, but after a certain point they actually start to include a midway boss. Typically there's a decent stretch with nothing else going on to take it out, but if you take too long you could end up getting mobbed in addition to that boss. On the plus side, if you're extra fast in taking it out, you get a short breather. One nice thing is that on easier difficulties, your base health actually replenishes itself slowly if you aren't firing. Obviously, you're taking a big risk if you do, but it can come in handy for situations like this. Enemies actually have a pretty good variety, but mostly boil down to a few categories. The basic one has what I can only describe as fireballs. It's different from bullets. Some will fire straight ahead, others, especially ground threats, fire in your direction. They tend to be pretty slow firing though and low damage, so they're not the biggest threat. As long as you're mindful, it shouldn't be a big problem. The next branch up is missiles. They tend to be more damaging and durable themselves. On the plus side, only really the fireball ones will track you. This makes the missile launcher enemies much more predictable, and since enemies tend to have shadows just a bit out ahead of them, you can prepare yourself. Above that is enemies firing what looks like droplets of some kind. I think of it as acid because it does quite a bit more damage, but you get one that's similar that's called the plasma cannon, so I guess it's just plasma. They're still straight firing, but you especially want to be careful about being hit by them. The enemies that fire it also tend to move pretty quickly, making reliably dodging it more difficult. Be wary of them. The highest tier is laser beam enemies, only really found in the outer region, thankfully. Much like your own ultimate laser weapons, they can cut through you like tissue paper, but thankfully only in very small bursts. They, more than any other enemy, practically require the extra shields to be able to tank surprise hits. Thankfully, like all enemies, they have set patterns. With some trial and error, you can see them coming. Better to use trackers, though, to stay out of their line of fire. Speaking of the outer region, you get 3 regions of the game and you can actually choose whichever one you want. The Bravo sector, which seems to be a military base, the Tango sector, which is in a thick jungle, and the outer regions in space. I recommend you do them in that order because they get increasingly difficult. You also get 4 difficulty settings, although the first one is just the first 4 levels and then it spits you back out, so for all intents and purposes, you just got 3. You've got Rookie, Veteran, and Elite. This determines how many enemies you'll be put up against, and it can get pretty brutal on the hard difficulty, especially later stages. Even completely armed to the teeth, you'll have to be careful. Of course, one of the more damaging prospects is crashing into another ship. Depending on how much health they've got, so bosses especially, it could really do a number on you. Some enemies actually dive bomb you with this in mind, so watch out. In some levels there are landmines scattered about that move towards your ship. Definitely take them out when you see them. As mentioned before, some enemies will also attack from the ground like trucks, tanks, and turrets. One type of turret in particular is hidden, but you can shoot its position if you see it coming. Some bosses are even on the ground, although obviously not midway bosses. The finale boss of the game is actually a great big Omega base boss in the outer regions. Weirdly though, one of my favorite enemies to fight is a sort of aircraft carrier. It starts appearing in the Bravo Sector Wave 5 and appears scarcely after that. Maybe it's because I've seen it in the computer demo. Also helps that you get a good amount of time to destroy it before it acts. It actually acts by unfolding 2 small ships to the sides before attacking itself. Despite what I called it, it doesn't actually produce fighters apart from that, but it's a neat little armada type of enemy regardless. It's probably one of the beefier enemies that isn't a boss, really. To quote Marge Simpson, I just think they're neat. There are also some treasures you can grab for extra money of varying value. Since it adds to your money though, you can't just exit the level to keep it like you can with weapons and other supplies. Still handy for a boost of cash though. All in all, the gameplay is quite engaging and has enough to keep you on your toes without being full-on bullet hell one-hit kill craziness. Since you have 3 difficulty levels to choose from, you can tailor it somewhat to your level, and Elite will definitely give you a challenge. You can even go crazy and restrict yourself of or to certain weapons. It's that kind of game. If you're expecting a novel's worth of plot in this game, then you're definitely in the wrong review, my friend. Granted, while the plot is indeed very shallow, there is still something to it. It seems the main character is a pilot who's been hired by the Megacorps to presumably take out certain targets. This sort of justifies the act of destroying ships and buildings getting you cash. You're basically a bounty hunter taking out specific targets. A bit more story is shown in the intermission screens after you complete each sector. After beating the Bravo sectors, it explains that you destroyed Lithos Petroleum's rig and shows docks in flames. Beating the Tango sector shows something more vague, just flaming wreckage in the forest, presumably the big armada that you were fighting. Finally, beating the outer regions just basically says you've succeeded and are basically the big hero who's achieved fortune and victory that's unmatched. So yeah, there's not exactly super in-depth story to be had here, but there's just enough to give you some kind of context and make you feel super big for overcoming everything. It did what it had to, especially for games around this era, and do you really need a complex reason to blow stuff up? Having released in 1994 after games like Doom, it's probably not the most technically impressive in the world to see a 2D top-down shooter. That being said, it takes that and manages to be a very beautiful looking game. It takes on a somewhat realistic style with mostly military-looking buildings and enemies. A lot of the designs are very sci-fi, but it has an overall gritty tone that lasts throughout the entire game. Each ship is distinct enough from one another that you can pretty easily tell them apart. They range from helicopters to tanks and trucks to smaller aircraft and some heftier and slower moving ships. One is even sort of disc-shaped and spins around, emphasizing a 3D look that's pretty nice in motion. As mentioned in gameplay, each ship also casts its own shadow, which can allow you to see them coming a split second before they actually appear. The environments themselves range from wasteland to grassy to forest to industrial to oceanic to literal surface of moon and everything in between. A couple of levels even take place at night with everything coated in darkness and only things like light sources and jet exhaust to cut through it. Thankfully everything's still perfectly visible, it's just a nice aesthetic break from the norm. The way the enemies and buildings are laid out, especially in regards to the first sector, make each level a very unique and memorable experience. For instance, the 6th level has an interestingly complex section of buildings that look almost like veins and can take some effort if you're looking to destroy all of them. The particle effects also look nice, from the different types of weapons fired to the damage feedback and destruction effects. It's especially nice destroying buildings and seeing the damaged interiors that become visible. It gives a nice sense of 3D depth. Pretty much everything explodes upon destruction, including docks, and that's done to make it look that much more like an action movie, which I'm all for. It also has some short CGI cutscenes, which hold up pretty well due to using mostly large sprites and backgrounds with some limited animation. The game over screen is actually pretty sad to look at, with the plane falling to the ground and then it shows it crashed with a pilot gone limp. It also has some fairly sad toned music behind it. And speaking of music, the music in the game actually varies quite a bit in terms of tone. The very first level has this super bright and cheery tone, but then the second is more somber and almost mysterious. My favorite though is the one that starts in Wave 5 of the Bravo sector and has this very triumphant tone. The developers must agree because it's used for the final wave of all 3 sectors and it's very fitting for a grand finale boss. It's even more fitting for the little snippet of your victory. It really makes you feel like an unstoppable warrior who just conquered a hellish war zone. Some other music can even be downright depressing, like the music in Bravo Sector's Wave 7. The sound effects are just fine, with explosions fittingly punchy and the like. Noticeably though, there's no audio feedback for damaging enemy ships, but the visual feedback more than makes up for it, and they do make a punchy explosion sound. Audio feedback for your own ship is pretty much impossible not to notice, which is good since you'll want to know when you're taking damage. All in all, the presentation holds up quite well for a classic old 2D top-down shooter. There's plenty of gritty detail everywhere, the particles look nice, and the environments are varied enough that each level looks pretty distinct overall. It's especially satisfying to destroy buildings to see the aftermath, and dropping a mega bomb especially showcases these results quite nicely. What else can I say, except it's a treat to play through for both the eyes and ears. It's just realistic toned enough that it feels like a somewhat serious military shooter, but it's still very much a super exaggerated action movie mayhem thing. For its time, I think it's just fine. Raptor Call of the Shadows is a pretty spectacular top-down shooter indeed. It gets just hectic enough, especially on the later stages and higher difficulty levels, to put the squeeze on you, but it never gets to genuine bullet hell territory. It also gives you enough purchasing options to mostly turn things in your favor, but it's still up to you to fight your way through from there. If you like this kind of genre at all, or just want to give a little reverence to gaming history, feel free to try it out. Sadly, the iOS version doesn't seem to work anymore because 32-bit dropped, but at least you can still use DOSBox for the original version. That is it for my review. Thank you for watching. This week's epic freebie until next Thursday is Speed, Brawl, and Tharsis. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified of more content. A like always helps, and that is it for now. Capitalize on life, and I'll see you next time.